Hello, and welcome to this IFG live event on how the UK can be a global leader in climate adaptation. Thank you very much for joining us on this lunchtime on what is a somewhat grey and grisly day here in London. I'm conscious that talking about the weather is an awfully British thing, but equally the weather and its impact seems central to what we're here to talk about today. So I hope that what follows will be both a thoughtful and timely discussion of an incredibly important topic and give you all some food for thought. I'm really delighted to be joined by a truly exceptional panel today. We have Professor Julia King, Baroness Brown of Cambridge, who chairs the Climate Change Committee's Adaptation Committee and recently led the CCC's independent assessment of climate risk for the UK government's third climate risk assessment. We are also joined by Her Excellency Syeda Muna Tasneem, the High Commissioner for Bangladesh, who has recently helped to forge the UK-Bangladesh Climate Action Partnership. I'm also pleased to welcome Dr. Jane Strachan, who is Head of International Applied Science at the Met Office, and finally Richard Blewett, the Executive Director of International at the British Red Cross. And I would like to take this moment to thank the Red Cross and the Met Office for partnering with us to make this event a reality. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get going. I encourage you all to use the Q&A function from the get-go to share your questions. I'm going to put some opening questions to our panel for about 20 minutes or so. But we really want to get your questions and hear what you want to know about. So if you could get those in, and when you ask a question, it helps us if you can add your name and where you're from. If you don't have a question, but like what others are saying, please up-like them so we can see the best and most pertinent questions in the mix. And I would also encourage you to join the discussion on Twitter using the event hashtag IFGClimate. Now, according to the US's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, 19 of the 20 hottest years since 1880 have occurred since the turn of the millennium. The other year, 1998. The last time global temperatures fell was in 1976. And similarly, 5 of the 10 wettest years globally have occurred this century. Here in the UK, the Met Office ranked 2020 as the 3rd hottest year since 1884, the 6th wettest since 1862, and the 8th sunniest since 1919. And we know that these trends are the consequence of climate change, driven by our emissions of CO2, methane, and other gases. If there was ever a shred of doubt that climate change is here and affecting us all, the first 6 months of 2020 should really have put that away. We've seen devastating floods in China, India, and Germany, winter storms that took down the power grid in Texas, and a heat wave that is causing an extreme drought in the Western US. And across the world, rich nations and poor nations alike are facing the reality that we live in a 1-degree world now, and we are heading for 1.5, likely 2. Heat waves, floods, winter storms, and the consequences that follow are challenges that we need to confront now. Yet, to quote our panelist Baroness Brown, adaptation remains the Cinderella of climate change, still sitting in rags by the stove, under-resourced, underfunded, and often ignored. So today, we're going to consider what can be done and what the UK's role is in this, both as a leader and as a partner. Richard, if I could come to you first. Climate adaptation has often been seen as the poor relation to mitigation, yet we need to become more resilient come what may. It's not really an option. I just like to ask, what's your experience of raising the issue of climate adaptation within the UK government and with others been like? And does the British Red Cross find that the approaches or attitudes to the challenge of adaptation vary when the focus is domestic versus abroad?
Thank you very much, Marcus. So I would like to start by, thanking everybody for being here today. The Red Cross, Red Crescent, and the International ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, we've been worrying about climate for a very long time. We've had a climate reference centre working for 17 years. And you might think, well, why would a humanitarian actor care about climate? Well, the reality is that we've been seeing the impacts of the climate crisis over that period of time accelerating. And so the climate crisis is a real and present challenge. If we look at COVID, conflict, and climate crisis, this is having devastating effects, these combinations of challenges to millions and millions of people around the world. So it's a really serious matter for us. It's very good that in July, there was the first ministerial meeting in preparation for COP26. And listening to Patricia Espinosa, she highlighted, the recent extreme weather events, raising both the attention not only of decision makers, but also of the general public, the general public are sort of starting to get a greater level of understanding. And that's critical to create the momentum for political will to scale our ambition. But at the same time, Alok Sharma, the COP president, kind of highlights in that meeting only this month that we have a long way to go. We're not yet close enough to really have confidence that COP26 is going to deliver. So if I come to your question about mitigation and adaptation, I mean, obviously it's good that Britain has an ambitious target on mitigation. It's obviously good that the COP presidency is pushing for a net zero initiatives on mitigation. The Red Cross Red Crescent in its Strategy 2030 has placed both mitigation and adaptation at the heart of our future humanitarian work for decades to come, for good reason. We will speak up about mitigation because if we don't mitigate, we're going to have a massive humanitarian landscape all over the world. We already have one linked to the climate crisis, and it's just going to get worse and worse quickly. And so it's very important that mitigation initiatives are prioritized and happen. At the same time, on adaptation, you know, there is a very small amount of money flowing to adaptation around the world, and countries that have not created the climate crisis are not being financed sufficiently or supported to be able to deal with the consequences of it. So adaptation and being able to help your communities and society be able to withstand these extreme weather events is absolutely critical. Looking forward, the UN estimates that adaptation finance must grow by a factor of 3 to 16 times by 2030. I mean, so we need a massive increase in public financing for adaptation to protect communities. We also know in very, very poor countries and conflict-affected countries, most of the existing climate money doesn't go there. So whatever climate money is available, very vulnerable communities in very at-risk places that are very affected by climate change, 20 of the most vulnerable climate affected countries in the world have conflict related matters that they're dealing with, they get almost no financing. So then there's this talk of the 100 billion every year. Well, it hasn't materialized. And, you know, for much of the developing world and the emerging economies, they are demanding for COP26 that this 100 billion materializes and is delivered, but most importantly, it has to be delivered and enable national ownership and enable communities to be engaged with it so that it actually reaches those most in need. We really welcome the fact that the UK government has placed adaptation as one of the 5 pillars of its agenda for COP26. It is great that there is a race to resilience, to build momentum around resilience. It's really good that the UK government with other governments have formed the Adaptation Action Coalition, and over 35 countries, I think, now are part of that. It's also good that the UK government has sponsored an initiative to look at access to financing. They started that in May this year, just 2 months ago. So just really encouraging that we build this momentum to the 100 billion target. At the same time, of course, the UK has just cut its aid budget. You know, that is not a clear and unambiguous message about a commitment to increasing financing for adaptation, even if they do target their own resources in the future towards adaptation. So we would prioritize a couple of things on this agenda. One would be the importance of scaling anticipatory action. And we've worked a lot with Met offices around the world with linking meteorology to communities, because if you can respond before a disaster, you can actually save lives and save livelihoods and reduce cost and reduce human suffering. And we really welcome the fact that the UK government supports the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership, which plans to make 1 billion people safer from disasters by 2025. So the question then about the last piece of your question of attitudes and challenges around adaptation home and abroad. I think at home, I mean, Baroness Brown is going to be much more eloquent to talk about that agenda than I am. But I think we are very worried about whether there is a consciousness in the public about the threats of heat, the effects of flooding, and general sense of this is an important issue here in the UK that has humanitarian and human consequences. And at the same time, you know, we know from recent polling that only 42% of the UK public think flooding has serious impacts in the UK. And more concerning, 1 in 4 don't think that the UK is hot enough to experience a heat wave, despite the fact that we had 2,500 excess deaths occurring in England during 2020's heat waves. Now, we have just launched a report just this week on feeling the heat. with the Met Office, really giving practical tools and ideas to help policymakers deal with heat waves. I mean, last week was a very hot week. And in the context of, people not being completely able to move around, the risks of dehydration and potential loss of life from a heat wave are very serious. And so we think that there's a long way to go to build more momentum around this agenda in the UK, and particularly the upcoming national resilience strategy is going to be a big opportunity to move forward this agenda. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard. That's some really provocative thoughts there. If I could come on to Baroness Brown next. You recently completed the UK's third risk assessment, which laid out the urgent need for the UK more resilient. Could you just sort of tell us a bit more about what the priority areas for action are here? And I think following on from it also, what do you think the UK can both learn from other nations about this, and how can it offer models for others to follow in response to the adaptation challenge?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to talk. And it's great to follow Richard from the Red Cross, because he read their report, feeling the heat is very important and very timely. We published at the end of June the materials to support the UK's next climate change risk assessment, CCRA 3, which the government will present to Parliament either towards the end of this year or early next year. And we produced, as the Adaptation Committee of the Climate Change Committee, the technical report, the report of the relevant research that has been going on, and also our independent advice. The technical report flags up over 60 areas of risk that need to be thought about. And in our advice, we did some fairly radical prioritization, really, because we felt there were a number of topics that were particularly urgent, topics that are really key to major policy initiatives like net zero, and things that we think the government can deal with in the current Parliament, so we can take urgent action. But we also flagged up that we really do need to start looking at the extremes of the distribution. That we like to think, oh well, the average thing that's likely to happen is this, so we can base all our planning on this simple number, the middle of the distribution. We've got to look at the extremes of the distribution, and we've also got to be prepared for the unexpected. And of course, actually, then what did we see? But we saw the unexpected in Europe, and I think it showed even how well prepared countries like Holland were really very badly hit by the unexpected extreme of flooding that they experienced. We also emphasised that climate change is already happening, and it's been great to see the Met Office report stressing that as well, and that there is already a lot of change locked in by 2050, which even when, as we hope, we're on a 1.5 to 2 degree maximum temperature rise path, we still need to recognise that we will see significantly more change happening until 2050, and in some cases beyond. But let me get to those 8 priority risk areas. And the first one is absolutely what Richard was just talking about last. It was the risk to people's health in the UK from heat. And that really is something we are hugely unprepared for. We've been telling the government we must do something about this for 10 years. In that period, we've built almost 500,000 new homes which overheat in weather like we've had recently. And as the Met Office is saying, we've got to prepare for, seeing temperatures certainly in the southeast of 40 degrees centigrade in the summer. And of course, in places like Bangladesh, they know about the even greater experience of extreme heat. And we need to be thinking about the impacts of extreme heat overseas. I mean, when it gets too hot for people to pick our coffee beans, what are we all going to be sitting around drinking at break time? There are real impacts to us and to our comfortable way of life of climate change overseas. So we are all in this together, not just for mitigation, but for adaptation as well. the next area was risks to the delivery of net zero. To deliver net zero in the UK, we're going to be relying on a lot of negative emissions and sequestration of carbon by the natural environment. And so unless our soils and our peatlands and our wetlands and our trees are healthy, we are not going to be able to sequester carbon in peat, sequester carbon by planting more trees, increase the yields of crops to make room for the trees. So we have really got to pay attention to the state of nature and the condition of nature, not in the climate we have today, but in the climate we will have in 2050, when it will be hotter. In some parts of the country, it will be drier. We will see more flash floods taking the surface of and the nutrients out of the tops of our soils. So we've got to be able to cope with that in order to deliver net zero. We've also got to recognise that the net zero world will be a different one for us in 2050 in the UK. At the moment, we get about 15% of our energy in total comes from electricity. By 2050, over 60% of our total energy use will be electricity. And today we already see cascading failures. So if an electricity substation gets flooded somewhere, we see that the transport system may come to a halt locally. We see that our IT fails, we can't communicate, our phones don't work. We see huge cascading failures in a small area. And that's with only 15% of our energy coming from electricity. When we are almost entirely dependent on electricity, a small failure due to climate change in our electricity system will have huge impacts. And so we really need to step up in terms of our understanding of the risk to key systems like our electricity system. And then there are a number of other key risks we flagged up, risks to our way of life and our economy. So in the more general risk to nature, nature is so hugely important to us, and yet we don't value it properly. And we are losing it very fast, and climate is going to accelerate that unless we take steps to make sure nature is in a good condition, unless we invest in it. The risks to our supply chains. We've seen impacts on our supply chains due to COVID, but actually there are going to be huge impacts on our supply chains due to climate change, and actually particularly to our food supply chains. Only about half of our food in the UK is grown in the UK, so we're hugely reliant on other countries. So if they have heat waves and droughts in Spain, then we'll be very short of salads. We are so reliant, as I say, we are so reliant on other countries, and actually adaptation in other countries is something we really do need to support. We also need to take more notice about overseas risks. Overseas risks, that includes those supply chain ones. There was flooding in Thailand a few years ago, which led to a worldwide shortage of disk drives because 3 key factories in Thailand were flooded. We are so interdependent. We really do have to support each other in this area. But of course, also, we know that climate change causes war, causes migration, all those sorts of challenges overseas, which just because we're an island, we can't pretend don't affect us as well, and affect, of course, generally global stability. So there are huge risks to us in the UK which need investment and which we need to recognise. But we also need to recognise that helping the rest of the world adapt is actually helping ourselves, that we are so interdependent these days. And what can we learn from others? Well, I think countries like Bangladesh, they of course have experienced much worse examples of impacts of climate change. They have much more experience of things like early warning systems, making sure that the population know how to respond when a serious event happens. We're starting to do that with things like the Met Office warnings and the Met Office flood and the Environment Agency flood warnings. We now have the new Met Office heat warnings. But I don't think we're yet properly attuned to that, because as Richard was commenting, people don't yet understand how sensitive to climate change impacts we already are in the UK. So we have an enormous amount, I think, to learn about planning for really major events from our partners overseas. So it really, really is important that that we all talk together about this, that we support each other, and we recognise how dependent we are on successful adaptation overseas as well as in the UK. Thank you.
Thank you, Baroness Brown. That was really interesting, and I'm really pleased actually you've preempted me, just bringing up the nature of how interconnected this problem is, and how we're all in this together. I'd like to come to Excellency Tasneem now, and thank you again for giving us your time today. Bangladesh, as Baroness Brown mentioned, is a nation that has been confronting the hard realities of climate change for some time now, and you've been a vocal proponent of climate adaptation work. What I'd be really interested to hear from you about is actually sort of to Baroness Brown's point about how this has been neglected. Why do you think climate adaptation has had so little political impetus? And also, when you're engaged in diplomacy, what has your experience been of moving climate adaptation up the agenda? What's helped to shift the focus of other governments towards the issue, and what do you see as the remaining obstacles here?
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Institute for Government for inviting me, and I'd like to say hello to all the very distinguished co-panelists, especially Baroness Brown. It's so wonderful to have someone from the Met Office, because for Bangladesh, Met Office is our best friend, because they tell us for early warning is exactly when the cyclone is coming, and we have developed one of the finest early warning preparedness, natural disaster preparedness, by which we can move. We have the capacity to move millions of people in less than 5 days. That's what we did last 2020. There was Cyclone Amphan in Bangladesh, if you recall, and we moved with the Met Office early warning 2.3 million people from our coastlines to cyclone shelters in 5 days. So, great to see Met Office and everybody else that are co-panelists here, Dr. James Strachan as well. I want to, respond to the first question, that why adaptation has not received equal importance as mitigation. The answer is very simple. Currently, you know that we are the president of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is a forum of 48 most climatically vulnerable countries in the world, including the small island developing countries, coastal countries, low-lying countries under drought, such as Ethiopia, could be Rwanda, and then all the Pacific and Caribbean countries, and Bangladesh is leading them. Now, one characteristic about all these countries is that they have some extreme situations where the existential threats are there, so they will go underwater. For example, Bangladesh, by 2080, IPCC report says that Bangladesh's 40 million people in the coastal areas, 19 districts, might become climatically displaced. That means it may go underwater. So this is the largest number of people. So when, according to our global climate risk report, 1 out of 45 persons are at climate risk in Bangladesh to be displaced. In Bangladesh, it's 1 out of 7 persons because of global warming and the sea level rise. So the characteristic of CVF countries, we've seen that we contribute the least to global emissions. Our carbon footprint is negligible. Bangladesh's is 0.4 and less. It's not even 0.4. Metric ton, where, I don't want to name countries, but there are countries who are giving 16 metric ton. Their square meter is much, much smaller than us. Population is negligible, but our population is 170 million. So therefore, these countries are emitting the least, but they're being victimized the most. Why? Because the G20, which is the greatest and largest emitters, they were not concerned about adaptation. And that is why in the policymaking at the political level. So if you look at the adaptation history in the climate discourse, you will see that in 2010, the first time there was a committee created at Cancun for discussing adaptation. And it was decided that in the Paris conference, it'll be discussed and it'll be an agenda of the conference. And therefore, adaptation came as a formal agenda in the UNFCCC process only in at the Paris, at COP21. And there it was decided, as our distinguished friend from Met Office said, that 100 billion US dollars, and there was no distinction between how it will be spent, whether it's for mitigation or adaptation. So now every country, especially CBF, is demanding that this 100 billion, of course, you know that 100 billion, we didn't see any progress in the 100 billion being realized or given to any country for adaptation purposes. So now the demand of the day is that at COP26, we want to see 100 billion every year, 50% for mitigation, 50% for adaptation. And I would just tell you that, you know, for global armaments, $2 trillion are being spent, but then we didn't see 100 billion. 2 trillion each year, every year, you know, leaders are spending in armaments 2 trillion, but where is the 100 billion? So what we see is that, you know, countries such as Bangladesh, I would just give you one example that, you know, as a diplomat, you also asked me the second question. Now, the things that we keep on talking about adaptation and resilience building, but there's also a limit to adaptation. How much can you adapt? So on the other hand, you have to cap the temperature rise. You have to focus also on mitigation. You have to ask the G20 to stop and reduce their emissions. And you have to go for all kinds of climate financing by which adapting can become easier for countries that are facing existential threat. So I'll give you one example of Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, each year we're losing 2% of our GDP to climate change. That means we have natural disasters such as cyclone every year. We have 2 times flooding every year. This didn't used to be this intense in ferocity and intensity, but this is becoming intense and frequent every year. And every year we're losing that. But then every year we also, you know, spending $5 billion in adaptation and resilience building. We're building dikes in our low-lying coastal areas, following the Netherlands, but, you know, a model. And then we are also, you know, being innovative in, you know, we'll just give you one nature-based solution, which is floating agriculture on water hyacinth. So this is a very ancient method of agriculture on low-lying marshy lands, and we are following that in an entire coastal area. We have the largest number of solar home systems. That is, each home will run by the, you know, they'll have an independent solar home. We have 5.8 million solar home systems in the coastal areas. And the other one is we've developed, you know, adapting to this situation, salinity and drought-resistant rice and crops. So if we want to address adaptation, we have to have the political will to first fund adaptation programs in developing countries, LDCs, and most climatically vulnerable. For us, our Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, she has a policy of self-reliance. That means you can't wait for people to come with money to help you to survive. We have to find some way of surviving ourselves. So she has created this $500 million fund, trust fund, and every year from our national revenues, and we are spending more than $5 billion each year in adaptation and mitigation. That means we are planting trees. We have the largest mangrove forest in the world. It's called the Sundarbans. You know, they're carbon sinks. So we're trying to do carbon capture as much as possible and keep our mitigation, you know, emissions low. But at the same time, that 100 billion has to be realized at this COP. What we saw in this COP in the UK is that there is, after Paris, this is probably the most politically intense COP, but we see there's a, you know, alliance of stars between United States and United Kingdom. This is a great, great alliance, and we have to take opportunity, you know, we have to capture this opportunity to make sure that adaptation financing is disbursed. Now, if you look at, somebody was speaking about DFID. See, Bangladesh does not take any aid from UK, but we want to do, you know, you mentioned about the climate accord. So on the 50th anniversary of Bangladesh-UK diplomatic relations, we are targeting a climate accord between the two countries, where we want to, you know, learn about transfer of technology and adaptation best practices. The problem is, you see, Bangladesh is a very small country with a very large population. We don't have land mass. We cannot spare agricultural land for for renewable energy by solar. We don't have enough wind draft, and we can't have wind energy. So there has to be solutions, alternate solutions to carbon fossil fuel also. So you know, people can't expect us to do renewable energy when we don't have any space for renewable energy. We have space only for crops. So we have to think of how these countries who have special needs, countries who are island countries going down, and what about climate justice? You know, that's another issue that is linked to adaptation. You can adapt, but eventually if you go underwater and you have displaced people, who's going to take those refugees? I will give one quote from my Prime Minister. You know, Bangladesh is last year, there's a Global Center for Adaptation by Ban Ki-moon, you may have heard. This is the first global center of adaptation, and Bangladesh last year has just hosted the South Asia Center of Adaptation. Then in South Asia, we have Maldives and Sri Lanka under threat. We have Bangladesh, low-lying coastal area under threat. There are different kinds of problems that India has, flooding and cyclone. So we are trying to learn from each other in this through the Global Center for Adaptation South Asia Center. And when inaugurating, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina said, in our war against nature, we will only lose. All our actions manifest that we are consciously destroying the very support system that are keeping us alive. So the time to take action to save the planet is not tomorrow, but today. By this, she meant that if you want to take action, you have to take it yourself. You cannot wait for people to come and give you money. We cannot wait for global leaders to give us money. We don't know whether G20 will get together at COP26 and actually deliver on 100 billion, but we're hoping that we do. And last point is that as CVF presidency, Bangladesh is among the 7 priorities. One was to bring the linkage between climate change and human rights. And last month, as a member of the Human Rights Council, Bangladesh had tabled this resolution. It was adopted by consensus, and we have requested, the resolution says we must appoint a special rapporteur for finding the loss and damage and different kinds of effects on communities and vulnerable communities on the impact of climate change, whether it's what sort of rights are being lost here, and who's going to pay the compensation under loss and damage under the Article 8 of the UNFCCC. So I will end there. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. That was really, really interesting, and I think just the breadth of like the challenge. You know, the idea that there is no one size fits all. You know, and the need for finance is really important. I was also really interested to hear you stressing both the need for both mitigation and adaptation. I think it's perhaps quite easy to take a fatalistic approach and think, well, we're going to go to 2 degrees anyway. Maybe we should just put all our money into adaptation. But so, I think seeing a dual track approach, and actually one of the questions we've had from the audience has been about where that balance lies. But actually, I need to come to Jane as well, and it was really interesting to hear you talking about your how the Met Office helps you with your the cyclone warning system. So, Jane, I'm sure you know plenty about that. I was just going to say, I saw that the Met Office published its State of the UK Climate Report, I think, earlier this week, and it really just underpinned everything we've heard so far. Just, sort of quickly, what is the Met Office's role sort of here, understanding both the local and global impacts of climate change, and sort of, how do you help develop these early warning systems?
Just first of all, I just wanted to say thank you to the other panel members and also to the Institute for Government for setting up this session. I'm honoured to be part of this panel. So to answer your first question, as the UK's National Meteorological Service, we provide weather and climate forecasts to help people make weather and climate sensitive decisions so that we can be safe, well, and also prosper. We work with partners around the globe to carry out our world-leading research to monitor changes in the climate. As you said, this week we've seen the launch of the UK State of the Climate Report for 2020. We also look into determining the causes of these changes and using our robust science and climate modelling capability to assess how the climate may change in the future. But it's important to know that our work doesn't stop there. So we build on that robust underpinning science by working with climate sensitive sectors in society to develop climate services and effective approaches to adapt to and manage climate risk. And to do this work, we have to have multidisciplinary partners, because we need to put that climate information into the local context. This is really essential to our work, translating the climate information into decision support information and tools. So for example, we've done some work, Newton funded work, which is called the Weather and Climate Science for Services Partnership Programme. This is about developing a network of partnerships to harness that weather and climate expertise, the scientific expertise in the UK and with partner countries, but we can't do this alone, to strengthen the weather and climate resilience of vulnerable communities around the world. So for example, this partnership is operating in Brazil, China, India, South Africa and Southeast Asia at the moment. This has led to co-development of climate services, for example, in China, to develop tools for urban planners to protect cities from the risks of weather events such as heat waves and flooding, but also, for example, developing new scientific capability to improve how we do seasonal forecasts of typhoons affecting that region to support disaster risk reduction. So everything that we do is based on our world-leading science, but is very much enhanced by the close working relationships that we have with partner organisations around the world. And then your question around, how do we work together? This is a global phenomenon. How do we, how do we combine the efforts of many nations? I mean, although we're the UK's National Meteorological Service, we don't just provide weather and climate information to the UK public, government and businesses. We share this information internationally via the global networks that we're very much part of and through our strong national and international partnerships. And that's really central to the way that we work. As Baroness Brown mentioned, weather and climate monitoring, assessment, understanding, it relies on strong international cooperation and collaboration. And the Met Office has always played a really strong role in that and benefited from that international effort. For example, we work very closely with the World Meteorological Organization. We're a WMO global producing centre in terms of playing a key role in that global network of climate information and capability. We exchange weather and climate information so that we can understand the state of the climate collectively and work together to apply that information then locally. And that includes working with other national hydrometeorological centres around the world to build that weather and climate science and services capability. We've also, for example, contributed scientists to all 6 assessment reports of the IPCC, but it's very much based on that international collaboration.
That's fantastic, really interesting, and clearly it seems to be having benefits, as we've already heard. We're getting an absolute flood of questions in from the audience, and I really want to get into those quickly. So I'm going to just sort of jump off. If I can encourage my fellow panelists to sort of keep their answers short so we can get through as many questions as possible, that'd be great. One sort of at the top, just from Ollie Watts at the RSPB, I thought this was interesting. He just wanted to ask, should we change our positioning and language on adaptation from resilience against to living with climate change? He recognises, as we've discussed, that this is a very real thing that's happening in people's lives. Do we need to help people understand that this is something that's happening now and something that's going to be here basically forever? And it's not a fight against that we will win. It's something where we have to fundamentally change. So, Excellency Tasneem, could I get your thoughts on that, and then I'll go to Baroness Brown.
So, of course, we have to live with climate change. That's exactly what countries such as Bangladesh is doing. So we, on the occasion of this CVF presidency, our Prime Minister has declared the Mujib climate prosperity. So we are coining this concept of climate prosperity. It means beyond adaptation, beyond resilience, you will not allow our prosperity to go down because of climate change. That's the basic theme of the prosperity concept. It says that invest in low carbon development pathway and invest for a long-term battle with climate change. But at the end, you have to win and you have to survive. And for that, you will not allow your prosperity or growth rate to go down, but you'll have to find out innovative ways to adapt to climate change. So adaptation is actually at the center of it, but adapt in a certain way that you also invest in low carbon development pathway. But then you can't just do it alone. Everyone else has to join in. They have to reduce their emissions because it is interlinked. No matter what you do, as long as emissions go on, you can't keep temperatures capped at 1.5. So I would like to really present the climate prosperity concept for that, living with climate and yet surviving and thriving.
That's really cool. Sorry, interesting, I should say. Baroness Brown.
Thank you, and I agree with the basis of Ollie's suggestion, but I just think we need to be very, very careful we don't imply that we can live with any level of climate change. And I wouldn't like to suggest that, because we have to live with climate change, we can live on a pathway to 4 degrees by the end of the century. I mean, I think people need to recognize that it's going to be uncomfortable living with climate change, and the more climate change we allow to happen, the more uncomfortable and the more damaging it gets. So I think we somehow need to encapsulate that. But he's absolutely right. People need to be thinking themselves into how am I going to live? And as Her Excellency, the Ambassador says, how am I still going to be able to farm and prosper in the new conditions? And they need to prepare themselves for that. But we still need to get this message across that it has to be as little climate change as is absolutely feasible. Yes.
Yeah, that's definitely not opening the door to complacency. Jane, do you have any thoughts on that you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's important is to, we're on parallel pathways here. Whichever, we need to follow a mitigation pathway, and there's various options for that, which we're looking at. Whichever mitigation pathway that we follow, we are going to have to follow that parallel pathway of adaptation and building resilience into our communities. But I think what's really important is that we need to look at, to be able to encourage society to make those mitigation actions and adaptations, is to look at the co-benefits. This is not just for climate change, this is for general common sense, good sense development. And I think that's really important to to get action to people, is to realise that actually this is really essential to engage in the community. Very much as Richard mentioned in his introduction, that we need to build understanding of the current climate sensitivities, but also the future, and use that as a basis for building what might happen in the future, and the understanding of how that might affect people very much on the local level. So it's taking it right down to, what is it going to feel like for you? What is it feeling like for you now? And what then actions might you take? So for example, we're doing some really nice work as part of the UK Climate Resilience Programme, working with local city councils to take that climate information right down to what's happening at that local level. So it makes it meaningful, it makes it actionable, and putting that information into the context that can create action, but framing it in that, what are the kind of general co-benefits to making those adaptations and mitigation actions?
That's really good. Richard, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I have another question that I think might be one that you would be great to jump on, if that's all right. We have a question from our familiar viewer, Anonymous, saying it's very disheartening to see that there are no sessions on health at COP26. He or she asks, if we can't get people to care about health when there's a global pandemic, what do we need to do better to get the message across? And I think, just going back to what you were saying earlier about how, and what others have said about how the health impacts of adaptation are so significant. Do you have any thoughts on why this is being deprioritized, and what we can do to sort of bolster that message?
Well, just to say, actually, only last week we were discussing with our colleagues in Geneva about how we partner WHO to bring the health dimensions of the climate crisis to COP26. So there is going to be a set of events and some level of voice and agency on the health and climate crisis, because you look at the heat problem and the loss of life and the risks. Imagine it's bad here in the UK. If you live in a very poor environment where you don't have any access to air conditioning, I mean, the risks to many high levels of loss of life that is very invisible. It's like a humanitarian disaster that no one sees, but it's a real one. Things need to change. Air pollution, the problems of air pollution. So there are many factors in the health question around health and climate change, where where malaria will now spread because of the change in temperature, and helping governments be ahead of the curve in terms of their programs to public health to address the growing health issue. So, definitely working on planetary health in the context of the climate crisis needs to be prioritized moving forwards.
I have another question actually for Excellency Tasneem from Will Worley, but I'm sure others may have thoughts on this. He wants to know, do you think that cuts to the UK aid budget, which has included some climate environment projects, has damaged the UK's credibility as a climate leader and its ability to lead the negotiations at COP26?
Thanks for the question. Actually, we saw the debates in the UK Parliament regarding this cut, and it was questioned across the board by many parties. But actually, UK in Bangladesh works with civil society organizations, and I believe that UK's aid, there was 2% dedicated to climate change that was going into Bangladesh. They were working with coastal NGOs for early warning and this. And I suppose it will have an impact on those civil society, because even though the government doesn't take any aid, but the civil society is the basis and foundation of UK support all around the world. So definitely, those civil society who are doing community level work with fringe, vulnerable communities at the fringe, at the absolute marginalized communities, would impact it. That's what I believe.
That's very, very interesting to know. Does anyone else want to come in on aid cuts? No? I have a question, I think, which all the panel may have views on, from my colleague Tim Durrant, and simply, what does the panel think of the understanding and awareness of adaptation and its dangers of not doing it, and why it is so low in the UK? As Baroness Brown says, it's been talked about for over a decade, but why hasn't it cut through? Like, I mean, you know, we've heard from Excellency Tasneem why it sort of hasn't received as much impetus at the political level, but like certainly at a public level, you know, are people going to sort of realise that this is more urgent soon? Like, what needs to change? Baroness Brown, could I maybe go to you first, and then if others have their hands up, and I'll come to you.
Well, I would have to. I think the weather is doing a good job at the moment of showing us exactly the sorts of things that have to change. I do think sometimes our language for adaptation. First of all, the word itself, adaptation, is an ugly and difficult one that I don't think people understand very well. But also the fact that we have to talk about weather and climate in probabilistic terms. I think confuse people by you know, the idea that you're in a region which has a 1 in 100 year probability of a serious flood. You have a serious flood. Lots of people then think, well, we've got another 99 years before the next one happens. So I think we need to get the language simpler and more direct. And I think actually we really need to integrate climate change, adaptation and mitigation into all of our teaching in schools and colleges, so that young people come through with an understanding out into their adult lives with a much better understanding of this. But it has been really good, both with our publication of the advice on the climate change risk assessment and with the Met Office's publication of the state of the UK climate. It has been really good to see how much this has been picked up by radio and television. And I hope that, you know, if we all keep going at it, it really will start to get much higher profile with people.
Thank you very much. Yeah, speaking of the weather, I mean, my downstairs neighbours were flooded out just 2 weeks ago, which is, you know, bringing it home, literally. Jane, I saw you had a hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. You know, I think Baroness Brown this is absolutely central. It's the way that we communicate our understanding of changes in the climate and potential adaptations. We work really closely. You know, we're a scientific community, but we actually work really closely with social scientists, for example, to think about how we communicate the climate science information, how we work together with vulnerable communities to understand what sensitivities they have, what decisions they're making. But really, you know, I think really it's working with different disciplines to really understand how people make decisions. What type of language we should be using to communicate that is really important to our science and our communication and getting people to take action. So I just wanted to say that, you know, we're doing a lot of work in that area because we do see it as really central to making people take action. I think it's really interesting, Baroness Brown, how you mentioned about, you know, changing, you know, the skills and learning, and I think that's really important too. A lot of skills in many different sectors of society are going to have to change and adapt. You know, for example, as we move to electric vehicles, you know, engineers are going to have to change from operating combustion engines to electrical batteries. You know, how homes are, the infrastructure of homes, the technology that you know, builders are going to have to learn to make sure that public buildings, that personal buildings are fit for purpose. There's a lot of change that's going to have to happen, and I think that has to start building in, you know, all the like you say, right down from early education.
Thank you. Richard had a hand, and then Excellency Tasneem.
Well, I would just say, you know, like Baroness Brown was saying, you know, what happens in the UK and what's happening around the world, we're in this together. You know, it has direct links back home. It's not like we live in an island separate from the rest of the world. And, you know, the UK public supports our humanitarian aid around the world, which is good. And let's hope that they will also support early action and prevention, because obviously prevention is cheaper. It can help preserve lives. Let's hope we can learn more from countries like Bangladesh and bring that learning into the UK so that we ourselves do better early action, you know, in an organized and effective way. Also, we should work on, you know, highlighting successes where in fact adaptation has delivered people not being affected by a flood and able to save their lives or save their goods, where they're less severely affected. And then lastly, what I would just highlight is at the moment, you know, only about 10% of existing adaptation financing goes to communities around the world. That is not acceptable, and it's not a way to get impact. You have to find a way to get the resources to where they're needed most, so that you can actually support communities, preserve and protect themselves from the effects of these extreme weather events.
I think that's really important, Richard, and I'm really heartened to hear all the sort of the repeated references to sort of communities and the need for local action. Excellency Tasneem, your thoughts?
Thank you. I'll just, echo Richard, because Bangladesh is a country that has been living with natural disasters for decades, for centuries. So for us, the local communities, the agriculture, the farmers, the coastal communities who experience floods every year, they lose their homes. They adapt to it. That's why we are such a resilient nation. That's why we still have a 6.1% growth rate. So what I'm saying is that learning from communities who are affected, for example, we have 20,000 cyclone shelters in our coastal area. That is where we evacuate people. We have a miking system by which by 24 hours, we can evacuate everyone from their homes. So people are used to it. So I think these are the experiences and best practices we need to share, because we know that no one's going to be spared from climate change and the effects of it, including we've seen floods in Europe, in UK, we've seen fires in different parts of the world. So for Bangladesh, we are branded negatively for centuries as a disaster-prone country, but we have really learned, and I've mentioned about floating agriculture. Why did we are adapting to that? Because we know in the coastal areas it's going underwater. So this is learning from nature and from experience. So sharing experience is extremely important, and learning from affected communities is very important.
Thank you. That was really, really good. Can I take a quick question just to Jane from Colin Maffat? A question about what is adaptation, what should we be considering in terms of the fact that the rate of change is not uniform around the world? And do we know what the key tipping points are and how close we are to passing those?
I mean, I think we're all waiting very much to see the, the launch of the AR6 IPCC report. And I know there's a lot of work that's going on in that report in terms of bringing together that that world-leading scientific understanding around tipping points, but also looking at the impacts on a regional perspective. As you say, the rate of change is not uniform, and understanding what those impacts might look like around different regions of the world, there's going to be a particular focus on that. So I think we're, really looking forward to seeing the outputs of that work. Again, the work on this is a demonstration of the international community working together to understand these impacts. So it's, a very good question. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. That was a really helpful answer. Just being conscious of time, I think I'm going to take one last question, which is from Amy, and for all the panel. Amy says, "This is also interesting and powerful. However, I feel quite helpless with how to help. What is the one thing that an individual can do?" So what is the one thing that we can do as everyday people? If I go to Excellency Tasneem first, and then I'll sort of work around.
Okay, so the one thing she can do is plant trees, and plant those kind of trees who are carbon sinks, that absorbs carbon. So in Bangladesh, our Prime Minister has given an incentive that we've already planted 10 million trees in the coastal areas, but we'll plant 30 million trees in the next 3 years. So I think a tree plantation, and I saw that it's in the UK's top priority list, 30,000 hectares of trees. So I think that should be a welcome. A simplest thing that a person can do is, plant a tree, or plant trees, particularly that are carbon sink. And number two is, one more thing they can do is, switch to solar energy as much as possible. I think these two goes for mitigation and adaptation both.
I think that's absolutely. Richard, what's one thing that we can do as everyday people to help adaptation?
Recycle. Small things make a big difference. I mean, and everybody doing that in a more organized and effective way, and then joining your local resilience committee, or finding groups of people that are interested in this agenda, and then finally bringing voice, talking about it with your neighbors, with your community. And if you can reach decision makers, do that, because we are not on a good path, and the likelihood of the COP26 not quite delivering what we all need to avoid 3% or 4 degrees, is significant. So, we need activism.
I absolutely agree with that. I think, I'm always staggered when they do polls and they show the number of people who are still sort of loosely unaware of this thing. I think talking about it is such a powerful individual act. Jane, what would you say to Amy? What's the one thing that we can do as everyday people?
So I'm going to say something slightly different here. I'm going to not just for individuals, but individual communities and countries. I think it's about joint action. So, for example, from the G7, I think what was really strong coming from this is to see the proposed joint action. So, for example, around working in that collective action to provide support to the most vulnerable to climate change and extreme events. And that can be from a nation, but it can also be in communities as well, to look at who might be the most vulnerable and work together to provide support. I think, for example, launch of the Adaptation Research Alliance, which is a global coalition, and we can have local coalitions as well across, pulling together our communities on climate, on development, on humanitarian action. That building coalitions and collective action, I think, is where the power is, and that can be on many different scales. So that's how I would finish.
I think that's a really good point, and actually sort of builds on what's also been said. I'm fascinated that this isn't just at the COP level. You have the C40 cities, and you have, as Excellency Tasneem said, you have the sort of the vulnerable countries forums. And I think, yeah, organising at every level, even down to sort of your local community, and really focusing on sort of what needs to be done is really important. Baroness Brown, the last word for you on what can Amy do as an everyday person?
Well, she can give some money to the Red Cross to support Richard's campaigns to help adaptation overseas, which would be a great thing to do, or arrange a marathon or a sponsored walk or a whatever to raise some funds. But she could also do some local research. I mean, if most of us have an indoor thermometer, if not, you can get one very cheaply. Find out how hot it gets in your bedroom, in your living room, in front of your windows. And think about the things you can do that, like keeping heat out by drawing the curtains on a hot day, or trying to make sure you get a through draft in parts of the house. Look at the local flood maps to check, the Environment Agency flood maps, to check whether you, and particularly perhaps do this for your grandparents. Think about how hot do their homes get? Do they know whether they're in a flood risk area? Are they signed up for the Environment Agency flood alerts? Make sure they know what to do when one of the Met Office high temperature new heat warnings comes up. Richard's recent report had lots of useful things to do for us all to try and combat heat, and things like drinking plenty of water, of course, are crucial. But particularly make sure the elderly people in your community, or people who are ill, or people with very young children, make sure they know about how to respond in these situations.
Thank you very much. And I think that's again, as a reminder that this is at all levels. Climate justice isn't just about rich nations helping poor nations. It's about, stronger people helping the weak in their own communities. Conscious we're at time, and I am so sorry to all the people whose questions we couldn't get to. There were just absolutely fantastic ones in the list, just really highlighting the sort of the breadth of this issue and the complexity of it, and the energy and enthusiasm that there is to solve it. We will be continuing to sort of host these conversations and look at this as the Institute for Government, and I hope we can keep working with the CCC and sort of our international partners, charities like the Red Cross, and government organisations like the Met Office to deliver progress on this. So just for the last thing, I'd like to thank again my panel, Baroness Brown, Excellency Tasneem, Richard and Jane, and I'd like to wish you all a very good day. It's been very good to have you. Thank you very much.